Are you overlooking your most important vital sign? Right now, millions of people, maybe even you, are walking around with a silent condition that's quietly damaging the arteries, kidney, and brain. And most of us have no idea. More people die from this one risk factor than smoking or even high cholesterol. I'm talking about high blood pressure, the silent killer. This might be the most important health conversation that you and I have this year. Today, I've distilled over 100 pages of the latest European ESC and American ACC/AHA guidelines into a clear, practical guide that you can act on right away, whether you want to prevent it, manage it, or simply understand your numbers. And here's the good news. Get this right, and you can add years, maybe even decades, to your life. In this episode, we will cover what high blood pressure actually is, who it affects, the damage that it causes if left unchecked, how to measure blood pressure at home properly, and the 6 most effective lifestyle strategies to lower it, which, if stacked together, could help you reduce your blood pressure by 25 points or more. Even if your blood pressure is normal or you haven't checked it since high school, stick with me. This episode might just change your life. Let's start by defining a few terms. When we say blood pressure and hypertension, what do we actually mean? Blood pressure is the force of the blood pushing against your artery walls. Every second your heart pumps, your heart is sending blood out like a pressure wave, and it's carrying oxygen, nutrients, and momentum. When your heart beats, that pressure peaks. That's your systolic blood pressure. When your heart relaxes between beats, the pressure falls. That's your diastolic blood pressure. These two numbers, the top and bottom of your blood pressure reading, tell us a lot. When they're too high, damage starts to build. Now that we know what blood pressure is, let's talk about why it matters and exactly how it can damage the body. And not in the abstract, but in the very real physical ways that high blood pressure silently damages your body and accelerates disease. Put simply here, when blood is exerting too much force on the endothelial cells that line our artery walls, it damages them. And given that every single organ in our body relies upon healthy arteries and blood flow, the downstream repercussions are widespread, leading to unnecessary suffering, disease, and premature death. In fact, so common is this that there is a specific acronym, HMOD, in the medical literature for organ damage due to high blood pressure. It stands for hypertension-mediated organ damage. The most common downstream consequences are vascular dementia, strokes, eye damage, atherosclerosis, obstructive and non-obstructive heart disease, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, microvascular complications, and chronic kidney disease. High blood pressure also ties back to previous episodes where we've spoken at length about cholesterol, ApoB, and atherosclerosis. When our blood pressure is high, there's 2 main mechanisms by which the risk of atherosclerosis is significantly heightened. Firstly, high blood pressure damages the endothelial cells, which is thought to lead to more of these ApoB-containing lipoproteins crossing the artery wall and becoming retained, where they trigger inflammation and deposit cholesterol as plaque. Second, and much less discussed, high blood pressure makes our arteries stiffer. You can think of your arteries kind of like a garden hose. When the hose is soft and flexible, water flows through easily and the pressure stays low. But if that hose becomes stiff or rigid over time, which happens to our arteries as we age, especially when exposed to high blood pressure, it loses its ability to expand. So now the same amount of water is being forced through a pipe that has no give. And the result, pressure builds up. And that extra pressure puts even more strain on the walls, accelerating damage and stiffness. It becomes a vicious cycle. Furthermore, if you have existing plaque, high blood pressure increases the likelihood that this plaque will rupture, potentially leading to a heart attack, stroke, or in some cases, death. In fact, every 20 millimeters of mercury increase in systolic or a 10 millimeter of mercury increase in diastolic blood pressure, the risk of death from ischemic heart disease and stroke doubles. To quote the ESC guidelines, persistently high blood pressure in systemic arteries is the hallmark of hypertension, which is the most important modifiable risk factor for all-cause and cardiovascular disease morbidity and mortality globally. Let that sink in. Globally, optimizing the force of our blood against our artery walls would reduce chronic disease and premature death more so than any other modifiable risk factor. Yet it still continues to fly under the radar. By now, I hope that you're engaged in this conversation and understand that blood pressure is not a risk factor to ignore. And the good news here is that it is non-invasive to test and pretty easy to do in the comfort of your own home, providing that you have the right equipment and protocol, which we will go through shortly. So that's the harm that high blood pressure causes. But how common is it? Let's look at the numbers. According to the CDC, 1 in 2 adults in the US have hypertension, which is approximately 120 million people. In people over the age of 60, that jumps to 3 in 4 in the US. Yet only about 20% of these people with hypertension have their blood pressure controlled under 140 over 90. That means that if you were to randomly select 100 US adults, approximately 50 of them will have hypertension, and approximately 40 of them will have blood pressure over 140 over 90. That is how prevalent this risk factor is. Countries like the UK and Australia are not far behind the US, both with approximately 1 in 3 adults having hypertension. Now you're probably thinking, what's driving this? 90% of hypertension is considered a primary hypertension. This is the form of hypertension or high blood pressure where no single cause has been identified. In these cases, high blood pressure is considered extremely multifactorial, with everything from genes, pollution, diet, exercise, body weight, smoking, salt consumption, artery health, hormones, kidney function, stress, gender, and more all playing a role. And it's not just costing people quality of life and years of life, it's costing countries in healthcare and productivity. As of 2014, which is a little while ago now, hypertension was costing the United States $131 billion per year in healthcare costs alone. Perhaps something that Donald Trump and Maha should be shining a stronger light on, more so than seed oils, but that's a conversation for another day. And here's the tricky part. Most people with elevated blood pressure won't feel anything. Let's talk about why that is and what symptoms to watch for. I mentioned earlier that in many cases, high blood pressure is silently damaging our arteries. In fact, it is often referred to as the silent killer, which is why proactive screening is so important. You're likely to see a high reading on a blood pressure monitor far before you experience symptoms. Many people can live with elevated blood pressure for years, even decades, without feeling a thing. No headaches, no dizziness, no obvious warning signs. Meanwhile, the damage is quietly building to your arteries, your kidneys, your heart, and your brain. And this is likely one of the reasons why so many people diagnosed with hypertension do not have it under control. If you don't feel unwell, you're less likely to remember to take your medication or follow through on treatment and lifestyle changes. That said, in more extreme or prolonged cases, some people do experience symptoms such as headaches, especially in the morning at the back of the head, blurred or doubled vision, nosebleeds, shortness of breath, chest pain, fatigue, or even confusion, or even a pounding sensation in the chest, neck, or ears. But I want to be really clear here. These usually do not show up until blood pressure is dangerously high, or the damage has well and truly already started, which is why you can't rely on symptoms to know if your blood pressure is elevated. You have to measure it. That's the only way to know. Just quickly, if you're enjoying this episode and the evidence-based content that we're putting out here at The Proof, please hit subscribe on YouTube and follow along on Apple or Spotify podcasts. All right, when you measure your blood pressure, how do you know what the numbers mean? A healthy blood pressure is considered below 120 over 80. That's a systolic under 120 millimeters of mercury and a diastolic under 80 millimeters of mercury. Once either of those numbers climbs above that range, it's classified based on how elevated it is. Here's how the American Heart Association breaks it down. 120 to 129 systolic with a diastolic still under 80, that's called elevated. 130 to 139 systolic or 80 to 89 diastolic, that's considered stage 1 hypertension. 140 to 149 systolic or 90 or higher diastolic, that is considered stage 2 hypertension. And if your systolic is over 180 or diastolic over 120, that is a hypertensive crisis and is considered a medical emergency. It's worth noting that in newer guidelines like the 2024 ESC recommendations, you might see non-elevated blood pressure defined as under 120 over 70 rather than 120 over 80. Don't get too caught up on that. What the clinical trial data consistently shows is that for most people, especially over the age of 50, optimal blood pressure is a systolic blood pressure below 120 and a diastolic blood pressure below 80. That said, if your systolic and diastolic blood pressure readings fall into different categories, which isn't that uncommon, you're assigned the higher blood pressure category, which, as we'll discuss later, directly affects the evidence-based treatment approach for you. For example, if your systolic blood pressure is 119, but diastolic is 88, this would be classified as stage 1 hypertension. If your systolic blood pressure is 141 and diastolic blood pressure is 88, this would be classified as stage 2 hypertension. It's also important to point out that when it comes to blood pressure, lower isn't always better. There is a condition called hypotension, low blood pressure, which isn't rare, especially in older adults. It's usually defined as below 90 over 60. We're not going to go deep on that today, but I just wanted to flag it for now and we'll cover it in a future episode. We've covered what blood pressure is, why it matters, and who high blood pressure affects. Now let's talk about how to measure it properly. There are 3 main ways to measure your blood pressure. The first 2 are the most common, at the doctor's office and at home using your own blood pressure cuff. But there's also a third option. It's called ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. This involves wearing a special device at home for 24 hours straight. It automatically takes readings throughout the day and also the night, giving you a very detailed picture of how your blood pressure behaves over time, including while you sleep. This sounds great, right? But there are a couple of downsides. The validated versions of these devices tend to cost a few $1,000s, so they're not really accessible to everyone, and they're not exactly comfortable. Many people find that they interrupt their sleep, and honestly, it feels like you've got a mini robot clamped to your arm. That said, with how quickly wearable tech is evolving, I wouldn't be surprised if we soon have validated, comfortable, and affordable continuous blood pressure monitors, ones that don't feel like you're wearing a tire pump to bed. But for now, and this is echoed in the ESC guidelines, we're not quite there yet. So unless your doctor specifically recommends ambulatory monitoring, stick with a combination of in-clinic and at-home readings using a properly validated blood pressure cuff. My recommendation is to keep getting your blood pressure measured in the clinic, but supplement that with at-home readings using a validated monitor. Both methods have their own pros and cons. Let's start with getting your blood pressure measured at the doctor's office. The big advantage here is that your reading is being taken by someone who is trained, or at least that's the idea. But here's the reality. Doctors are often pressed for time. Appointments are very short, and it's not uncommon for your blood pressure to be taken without the crucial 5-minute rest beforehand, sometimes right after you've walked in, or even while you're mid-conversation. Plus, and this is very important, being at the doctor's office itself can raise your blood pressure. It's called white coat hypertension, and it happens when stress or anxiety about the appointment causes your blood pressure to spike temporarily. On the flip side, some people have a normal blood pressure in clinic but elevated readings at home. That's known as masked hypertension. So both situations, stress-induced spikes or clinic-only dips, can give a false picture. If you're getting your blood pressure checked in clinic, here's how to make sure it's done right. Ideally, no caffeine or exercise for at least 30 minutes before your appointment. Sit quietly for 5 minutes beforehand, ideally. Feet flat on the ground, back and arms supported, and the cuff at heart level. And one more really important point. On your first visit, ask your doctor to check both arms. If the systolic number differs by more than 10 units between arms, it may indicate increased cardiovascular risk or underlying arterial narrowing, a red flag that's worth catching early on. I'll drop a visual summary on screen for those of you watching on YouTube. The bottom line here is that clinic readings are valuable, but they're just one part of the picture, and they really need to be done in the right manner. And to really understand what's going on with your blood pressure, consistent home readings are key. A little while back, I recorded an episode diving into the health benefits around Bragg apple cider vinegar to review the science before endorsing a product that I've personally used for years. After that episode and a great chat with the Bragg team, here's what stood out. There is definitely some confusion online. Is Bragg still organic? Has it been pasteurized? The answer, it is not pasteurized. Bragg apple cider vinegar is 100% organic. It is raw, unfiltered, and naturally fermented with the live culture or mother in every bottle. In addition to being USDA organic certified, Bragg apple cider vinegar is non-GMO, project verified, kosher, B Corp certified, made in the USA, and free from added sugars, preservatives, or artificial colors. Fair to say, this little apple cider vinegar has plenty to brag about. Plus, there are real wellness benefits that come with its 750 milligrams of acetic acid per serving. Acetic acid has been proven to improve post-meal blood glucose by supporting glucose uptake, particularly in people who have elevated blood sugar. As I wrote about in my book, I'm a huge fan, and I mean huge fan, of a daily salad for long-term brain health. And for flavor and function, I recommend dressing it with Bragg apple cider vinegar, garlic, salt, pepper, Dijon mustard, and olive oil. Head to bragg.com and use the code SIMON for 20% off your first order. That's bragg.com, promo code SIMON. Now, if you're measuring your blood pressure at home, there are a few things you need to know to make sure that you're getting accurate readings. Here's the 5-step home blood pressure blueprint that I've put together for you. Step number 1, make sure that you're using a validated device. This is critically important. There are independent websites that list reliable options. I'll link to some of them in the show notes. 2 to remember are stridebp.org and validatebp.org. Personally, I use the Omron 3 series upper arm cuff. It's less than $50 and honestly, one of the best investments that you can make in your health. Step 2, when you take a reading, make sure that you've been sitting quietly for at least 5 minutes. Again, your back and elbows should be supported, your feet flat on the floor, legs uncrossed, and the cuff should be at heart level directly on the skin of your arm, not over clothing. John Hopkins also recommends doing this on an empty bladder and not having a conversation, as both can elevate blood pressure. Step 3, when you first use your monitor, measure on both arms. Whichever side gives you the higher reading, that's the arm that you're going to use from now on. So far, we have validated device, 5 minutes rest, correct position. Now the last 2 steps. Step number 4, and this is key. Don't just take one reading and call it a day. To rule out measurement error, we're going to take multiple readings. Ideally, 2 readings in the morning, 1 minute apart, and then 2 readings at night, also 1 minute apart. Do this for 3 to 7 days and write all of the results down. Finally, step number 5. Once you have collected all of those readings, you're going to calculate the average. That is your true baseline that you can go back to your doctor with. Finally, when it comes to measuring your blood pressure at home, a bit of a bonus tip, take your at-home blood pressure monitor with you to your next doctor's appointment, and they can help validate its accuracy. One of the advantages of regularly measuring blood pressure at home is that clinical trial data shows that self-monitoring leads to lower systolic blood pressure, about a 3-unit reduction over a 12-month period. And that's probably because routinely measuring your blood pressure reminds people to watch their lifestyle, to take their medications, and or see their doctor if their blood pressure is reading high. It's through this process of replication, measuring blood pressure in clinic a few times and at home several times, that allows you to genuinely see your typical blood pressure and know the classification of your blood pressure. We don't classify someone's blood pressure based on a single occasion, one-off reading. So you measure your blood pressure as described, and now you're wondering, what's next? Should you make lifestyle changes? Should you consider blood pressure lowering medication, or both? Perhaps you've just worked out your systolic blood pressure is over 130. If so, don't panic. This is more common than you think, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what you can do. Fortunately, we do not have to guess here. We can use the latest ESC guidelines to direct us here. If your blood pressure is less than 120/70, you don't need to do anything other than continue to regularly screen for blood pressure and cardiovascular disease risk as you get older. And of course, maintain a healthy lifestyle so you can give yourself the best chance of maintaining healthy blood pressure as you age. For certain folks, you might be fortunate that your blood pressure is normal now with a rather unhealthy lifestyle, but things can change pretty quickly. So it's a good idea to implement healthy lifestyle behaviors as early in life as possible. If you have a systolic blood pressure reading of 120/129 or 130/139, but are considered low risk of cardiovascular disease, which means you don't have cardiovascular disease, you're a non-smoker, you don't have diabetes, etc., then the recommendation is to treat the blood pressure with rigorous lifestyle changes, which we're going to cover later in this episode. And then from there, measure blood pressure regularly and monitor cardiovascular disease risk yearly to see if anything changes over time. Pharmacologic intervention is not recommended by the guidelines here. However, if you have a systolic blood pressure of 130/139 and are considered high risk of cardiovascular disease, so you have cardiovascular disease or diabetes or chronic kidney disease, etc., the recommendation is to initiate lifestyle modifications followed by pharmacologic treatment 3 months later. If you have a systolic blood pressure of 140 or higher, the recommendation is to initiate lifestyle modifications and pharmacologic treatment immediately. Importantly, for those who have hypertension, where medications are indicated, the first line goal is to get systolic blood pressure to between 120 to 129, not below 120. And that's not because lower blood pressure is not better. It's just that the guidelines have adopted a slightly broader range to offer greater flexibility to patients and to clinicians, acknowledging that blood pressure measurements in routine clinical care can be 5 to 10 units higher than those that are recorded under more strict research conditions. Of course, I want to remind you I'm providing this information at a high level, not at an individual level. Anytime a treatment plan is being recommended to an individual, it has to be done by a doctor who has the patient's clinical history and current presentation in mind. There are a lot of caveats to the broad strokes that I've just described. For example, often treatment cannot be as aggressive in patients that are over 85 years old and who are frail and at risk of falls. And there are patients who don't tolerate specific medicines as well as others. All of this has to be considered. So please take this information and have a discussion with your doctor as necessary. The great news with all of this is that not only is high blood pressure a risk factor that we can relatively easily and affordably screen for, but there's clear evidence that we can significantly improve it with lifestyle and or medicine. Today, in this episode, we're going to focus on the lifestyle interventions, stepping through each so you can understand the specific change that you can make, as well as the magnitude of effect that this lifestyle change is likely to have on your blood pressure. And I have to say, every time I look at this research, it surprises me that there are relatively simple changes that people with hypertension can make that can lower systolic blood pressure by 11 points or more, which is similar to what you could expect from a first-line medication. And if you stack these, it's not uncommon for people to lower their blood pressure by more than 20 to 25 units. In a future episode, I'm going to go through the different blood pressure lowering medications like thiazide diuretics, ACE inhibitors, with a cardiologist that specializes in treating hypertension. For now, all I want to say, with regards to medications is that there are some drugs that have been shown to lower blood pressure and clinical events. And then there are others that have only been shown to lower blood pressure. The latest guidelines recommend using the former, specifically, and I quote, agents that have been shown to reduce clinical events should be used preferentially. Therefore, the primary agents used in the treatment of hypertension include thiazide diuretics, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, and CCBs, end quote. That's the medical treatment picture, but there's a lot you can do yourself. Let's walk through the 6 lifestyle levers that can make the biggest difference to your blood pressure. I call these the big 6. Weight loss, a healthy dietary pattern, especially the DASH diet, sodium restriction or lowering sodium, boosting potassium, exercise, and reducing alcohol consumption. We'll go through each, talk about the likely impact, and how to make it doable. For each of these lifestyle changes, we have clinical trial evidence showing reproducible reductions in blood pressure to varying degrees. Due to the short-term nature of some of these trials, we are assuming that these reductions in blood pressure translate to a reduction in cardiovascular events based on the results of population studies, genetic studies, and drug trials, which together really do paint the picture that elevated blood pressure is a direct cause of cardiovascular disease. The one exception here being sodium reduction, where we now have not only evidence for a blood pressure lowering effect, but also a reduction in risk of cardiovascular events or dying from cardiovascular disease. I've put a table on screen for those watching on YouTube that summarizes the approximate impact that these lifestyle changes have on systolic blood pressure. And for those who are listening along on audio, I'm going to walk us through this. Starting with weight loss, you can expect about a 1 unit reduction in systolic blood pressure for every 1 kilogram reduction in body weight. So for people who are overweight with hypertension, this could result in at least a 5-point reduction in systolic blood pressure or more. For people who are overweight but have normal blood pressure, the reduction in blood pressure will of course be smaller. Weight loss isn't something that we're going to deep dive today, but I have discussed dietary strategies to promote weight loss in a previous episode, which I'll link to in the show notes. It's worth noting that for certain people, these changes can be paired with drugs that promote weight loss, like GLP-1 inhibitors, for even greater weight loss and blood pressure reduction outcomes, and there is clinical trial data to support that. When it comes to overall dietary patterns, the strongest evidence that we have for lowering blood pressure through food is for the DASH diet, which is essentially a Mediterranean-style diet with more emphasis on low-fat dairy and limiting alcohol. The DASH diet is rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy, nuts, seeds, legumes, and lean animal proteins like fish and skinless poultry. It's also low in red meat and ultra-processed foods, added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. Altogether, this makes it a very plant-forward dietary pattern that's naturally high in unsaturated fats, fiber, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, all of which contribute to lower blood pressure and better heart health. A seminal clinical trial from 1999 by Frank Sachs and colleagues suggests that if you adopt a DASH diet and you have hypertension, your systolic blood pressure may drop by as much as 11.6 points. And even if you have normal blood pressure, it could drop by as much as 3.5 points. The same research team also looked at how effective the DASH diet was at lowering blood pressure in 3 different contexts: a low salt diet, a moderate salt diet, and a high salt diet. No surprise, the biggest reduction in systolic blood pressure, which again was around 11 units, was observed in the low salt DASH diet context. Interestingly though, and we'll come back to this in a moment, the reduction was not as high as one might predict by simply adding the individual effects that sodium restriction and the DASH diet each have on their own. Now you might be wondering, what about vegetarian or vegan diets? There is growing evidence that these plant-based diets that further restrict animal foods also help reduce blood pressure, especially when they emphasize whole foods, minimally processed plant foods. A 2023 umbrella review found that both vegetarian and vegan diets are associated with lower systolic and diastolic blood pressure compared to omnivorous diets. And when vegan diets have been specifically studied in people with hypertension, they've been shown to lower systolic blood pressure by about 4 units, which is a meaningful reduction, though perhaps not quite as large as what we've seen with the DASH diet or even lacto-ovo-vegetarian diets, which was the conclusion of a recent meta-analysis of clinical trials looking at a wide range of plant-rich diets and their effect on blood pressure. I wasn't able to find a really good explanation for why this might be. One hypothesis is that dairy foods in particular provide specific milk peptides that have direct antihypertensive or blood pressure lowering effects and are also rich in calcium, which is another mineral that we know can lower blood pressure and is often low in poorly planned vegan diets. That said, as many of you will know, overall vegans tend to have the healthiest body weights and are at low risk of cardiovascular disease across the board, so that's worth keeping in mind. So it is an interesting point, but other than pointing out that vegan diet should definitely plan for getting enough calcium, I don't think that this is cause for concern. Last thing I'll say on diet is just to call out a few specific foods and food groups that have been shown to specifically lower blood pressure. These include dark leafy greens like arugula or rocket and other nitrate-rich foods like beetroot, as well as dark chocolate. Yes, chocolate is on the menu. Garlic, flax seeds, hibiscus tea, and even green tea. Coming back to salt and more specifically sodium, the average intake in Western countries is around 3,500 milligrams of sodium per day, whereas the latest ESC guidelines recommend limiting this to 2,000 milligrams, which is equivalent to about 1 teaspoon of salt or less per day. As its own intervention, we know that reducing sodium by 1,000 milligrams per day results in about a 2 to 3 point reduction in systolic blood pressure, and that this reduction tends to be greater in women than men. It seems that women are often a little bit more salt sensitive. Because approximately 80% of salt in our diet comes from ultra-processed foods, not from our salt shaker, the best way to reduce our sodium intake to below 2,000 milligrams per day is to adopt a diet that contains less packaged, overly processed foods. And when you are buying minimally processed packaged foods, things like canned beans or tomato sauce or broths, nuts, seeds, etc., opt for those that say low sodium, or better yet, those that say no added sodium on the packaging, and or contain less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving. And be mindful of plant-based meat alternatives, which can often be very high in sodium, and also marinades, including marinated tofu and tempeh. These things are often really jacked up in sodium. Also, deli meats and fresh bread. These often come without a label, but contain a substantial amount of sodium that really does add up over the day. If you make these swaps and you're still trying to get your blood pressure down, you can also consider what I'm now calling the mineral flip. Yes, the mineral flip. Swapping regular table salt for a potassium chloride or low salt alternative. This is the salt substitution that was recently shown in a Chinese randomized controlled trial to reduce risk of cardiovascular events and death. Over this almost 5-year trial, participants randomized to the salt substitute group had a 3-unit drop in their systolic blood pressure, a 14% lower risk of having a stroke, 13% lower risk of experiencing a cardiovascular event, and 12% lower risk of dying from any cause. Whether you're training hard or simply aiming to feel your best every day, IM8 Daily Ultimate Essentials has you covered. It's the daily multi-nutrient that I've recently switched to and now recommend, with 92 bioavailable nutrients including vitamin B12, vitamin D, iodine, choline, K2, CoQ10 for heart health, and MSM for joint recovery. It is NSF certified for sport. It ships to over 30 countries, including the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and works with both plant-based and omnivorous diets. I've used several multi-nutrients over the years, but IM8's clean formulation and commitment to science and clinical validation really stood out. So much so that I've joined their scientific advisory board alongside Dr. David Katz and Dr. Suzanne Devkota, two previous guests of The Proof. For listeners of The Proof, IM8 is offering 10% off your first daily Ultimate Essentials order with the code SIMON at checkout. Just head to im8health.com. That's IM, the number 8, HEALTH.com, and use promo code SIMON to get started. A question you might have is whether the health benefits of a DASH-style diet come from naturally reducing sodium, increasing potassium, or both. This has been studied extensively, and it appears that the answer is somewhat nuanced. While increasing potassium intake does help lower blood pressure, its benefits seem to be most pronounced in the context of a high-sodium diet. In other words, potassium acts as a buffer, helping to counter the harmful effects of excess sodium, such as endothelial dysfunction and arterial stiffness. However, once someone adopts a diet that's already low or moderate in sodium, the additional benefit of increasing potassium seems to be less significant. Now, that's not to say that potassium isn't important, but its protective effects, at least when it comes to blood pressure, seem to be most impactful when sodium intake is elevated. So rather than acting as a direct cardioprotective agent, potassium functions more like a counterbalance, mitigating sodium-induced harm rather than actively promoting cardiovascular health on its own. And this probably explains the earlier result that I mentioned, where the DASH diet didn't have as much of an effect on lowering blood pressure within the context of a low-sodium diet compared to a high-sodium diet. And that study actually states in the discussion, and I quote, "Low levels of sodium attenuated the hypotensive, blood pressure lowering, effects of potassium in the DASH diet," end quote. Point being that hyperfocusing on potassium, and especially potassium supplementation, is really missing the forest for the trees here. Potassium mostly matters in a high sodium diet, which is not the type of diet that we want to be eating in the first place. We want to shift to a dietary pattern that lowers cardiovascular disease rather than adding potassium supplements to a high sodium standard American diet, which would be the diet where a potassium supplement is arguably going to have more effect on blood pressure. I do want to quickly draw your attention to another mechanism that could explain, at least in partly, why plant-rich, plant-based diets are associated with lower blood pressure. Typically, we attribute the blood pressure benefits of plant-rich diets to their high potassium and magnesium content, their fiber content, their low sodium content, and the fact that they support a healthy body weight. But in recent years, researchers have begun to uncover another potential mechanism, and that mechanism lies in the gut. Studies now show that when we eat fiber-rich foods that are found in abundance in the DASH diet or vegetarian diets or vegan diets, our gut microbes ferment that fiber into compounds called short-chain fatty acids, molecules like acetate and butyrate, which have been shown to improve endothelial function, that is the cells that line the artery walls, have been shown to reduce inflammation, and even help regulate the nervous system pathways that are involved in vascular tone, how constricted or how dilated a blood vessel is, which affects blood flow and blood pressure. So part of the benefit of a plant-rich diet may come not just from the nutrients themselves, but from how those nutrients shape the bacterial ecosystem inside us and what those microbes in turn produce. One fiber worth highlighting here is beta-glucan or beta-glucans, a soluble fiber that is found in oats and barley. A 2015 meta-analysis looked at different types of fiber and found that consuming 4 grams of beta-glucans per day lowered systolic blood pressure by almost 3 units and diastolic blood pressure by 1.5 units. These are modest reductions, but they are certainly meaningful, especially when stacked with other lifestyle changes. And getting this amount of beta-glucans in your diet is totally achievable in a typical day. For example, about 1 cup of rolled oats, dry, provides roughly 4 grams of beta-glucans. So if you are looking for a simple, inexpensive, gut-friendly food that can support heart health, oats are a great place to start. This is backed by additional studies showing that oats can also reduce systemic inflammation and improve vascular function. Moving on to exercise, the next lifestyle lever that we can pull. Exercise is one of the most powerful interventions for preventing hypertension and lowering blood pressure in those with existing hypertension. Broadly speaking, the latest ESC guidelines recommend doing 2 forms of exercise each week. The first is aerobic training, the type that gets your heart rate up and keeps it there. When it comes to aerobic training, at a minimum, the guidelines recommend 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, so roughly 65 to 75% of your max heart rate, spread across 5 to 7 days per week, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic exercise, so 75 to 85% of max heart rate, over at least 3 days per week. This could be walking, jogging, cycling, rowing, or any other form of exercise that you enjoy that gets your heart rate to these levels. Importantly, when it comes to exercise, there appears to be a dose-response benefit. To quote the ESC guidelines, additional benefits are derived by achieving 300 minutes of moderate intensity or 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity per week, end quote. And yes, you can certainly mix and match these intensities. For example, 150 minutes of brisk walking and 30 minutes of running or cycling, more vigorous exercise, could be a great weekly combination for an individual. That adds up to 3 hours of aerobic activity, a target that I often recommend, not just for blood pressure, but for overall cardiometabolic health. On its own, sticking to this recommended amount of aerobic exercise each week has been shown to lower systolic blood pressure by up to 8 units. And that's without any dietary changes, medications, or weight loss. One cautionary note here, it's not recommended to do vigorous intensity aerobic exercise if you have uncontrolled hypertension with a resting systolic blood pressure over 200 or a diastolic blood pressure over 110. So that's the first form of exercise the guidelines recommend, aerobic exercise. But when it comes to moving your body and its effect on blood pressure, it certainly doesn't stop there. And this is one of the biggest changes in blood pressure guidelines over the past decade. The guidelines also now specifically recommend combining aerobic exercise with 2 to 3 sessions per week of resistance training, either dynamic, like push-ups, squats, or lifting weights, or isometric, where the muscle contracts without movement, like a plank or a wall squat. There is some debate about which is more effective. In fact, the ESC guidelines note that isometric training data is still emerging and somewhat inconsistent. That said, a 2023 network meta-analysis published after the ESC's latest guidelines, doing isometric wall squats was shown to reduce systolic blood pressure by up to 10 units. That is no joke. That is comparable to many first-line medications. Ultimately here, I think it comes down to personal preference and consistency, what you're going to adhere to best. Whether you prefer doing dynamic resistance training, 3 sets of 5 to 6 exercises, 8 to 12 reps each, twice a week, or simple isometric holds, the key is choosing what fits your lifestyle and what you'll stick to over time. If you are open to trying isometric wall squats, here is the protocol that has been shown to produce meaningful reductions in systolic blood pressure in the literature. Firstly, stand with your back flat against the wall and your feet about shoulder width apart. Step your feet forward roughly 2 feet from the wall, then slide down until your knees form a 90-degree angle, like you're sitting in an invisible chair. Make sure your back stays in contact with the wall and your knees stay stacked over your ankles, not pushing past your toes. Start by holding this for 20 to 30 seconds and work your way up to 2-minute holds as your strength improves. Perform 4 rounds, resting for 2 minutes between each, and then aim to do this at least 3 times per week. This is the exact approach that has been used in clinical trials where it was shown to lower systolic blood pressure by an average of 10 units. And if you want a little variety, you can substitute one or two of those sets with planks, again building up to 2-minute holds. One of the biggest upsides of these isometric exercises is that you don't need equipment, a gym membership, or even much space at all. Wall squats and planks are perfect for lunch breaks at work, hotel rooms while traveling, or even short breaks at home to break up long stretches of sitting in front of the computer. Now, I also want to mention that something that really stood out to me while revisiting this body of research is just how much of the blood pressure lowering effect from exercise occurs in the immediate period after a workout, in that acute period. This is a really key insight and one that I think is so often overlooked. And it suggests that for people with hypertension, the goal shouldn't be to just hit a weekly exercise target, but the goal should be to move your body daily. Otherwise, you risk higher blood pressure on your sedentary days when you're not getting that acute post-exercise effect. Friends, the data is clear. Creatine isn't just for gym enthusiasts. It is daily fuel for both your brain and body, supporting strength, recovery, and even memory and focus. That's why Momentus's creatine monohydrate is simply a non-negotiable in my own routine. And now Momentus has made it easier than ever and tastier than ever to stay on track. Their new creatine lemon comes in perfectly portioned single-serve travel packs, naturally flavored, refreshing, and effortless to mix with water wherever you are. No mess, no measuring, and most importantly, no missed days. Here's what sets Momentus apart. They only use CreaPure, the purest, most effective creatine monohydrate on the market, single-sourced from Germany. And every single batch is NSF certified for sport, which means that it is independently tested for purity, safety, and banned substances. This is the gold standard testing trusted by pro teams, Olympic athletes, and elite military operators. So if you've been curious about creatine, or maybe you've taken it and dropped off, this is your moment to get back on track with a formula that's clean, third-party tested, convenient, and effective. Head to livemomentus.com and use the code LIVINGPROOF for up to 35% off your first order. That's livemomentus.com and use the code LIVINGPROOF for up to 35% off your first order. Alrighty, moving on to alcohol or booze. Let's bust one of the most persistent myths out there. The idea that alcohol, particularly red wine, is good for your blood pressure and or cardiovascular health. This is a claim that's been repeated over the years and often feels like common knowledge. But when you actually look at the evidence objectively, without a bias for alcohol, that narrative doesn't hold up. If you're drinking 3 or more standard drinks per day, reducing your intake can significantly lower your blood pressure, especially if you're in the heavier drinking category. For example, if you're consuming 6 or more drinks a day and you cut that in half, research shows that you might lower your systolic blood pressure by about 5.5 units. That effect is going to be smaller if at baseline you're consuming less alcohol. So while for most people reducing alcohol may not be the biggest lever they can pull, it's still one that is worth considering, especially if drinking is a regular part of your routine. And I'll be honest, candid with you here, this is something that I have personal experience with myself. In my 20s, alcohol was a very regular feature of my life. Most weeks I was drinking 10 to 25 standard drinks, mostly packed into the weekends. Hate to think what my weekend blood pressure looked like. That was the norm for a lot of people my age living in Melbourne and Sydney, whether it was at house parties or bars or nightclubs or at the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, watching a game of football. We worked hard and we played hard. And playing usually, almost always meant plenty of booze. Now, I don't regret those years. They were full of great memories, and alcohol was a big part of how we connected socially. Alcohol was also, no doubt, in many ways, a social lubricant for me. It gave me confidence to talk to people particularly to new people, to loosen up in big groups. As a natural introvert, I'm not sure I would have had the same social life without it. Probably would have just stayed at home or been at home more or just blended into the background. But that changed over time. These days, 15 years on, I still go to parties. I still go to concerts. It's not about being boring and not having fun. There's arguably more fun in my life now than ever before. I just don't drink. Well, not much anyway. Over the past 7 years, I've averaged maybe 1 or 2 drinks a year. I swung all the way to the other end of the spectrum. And honestly, I haven't looked back. It did take some growth, but I eventually realized that confidence doesn't have to come from a bottle. I just had to get real with myself and get comfortable with who I was and be okay sharing that version of myself with others without the temporary disinhibition that alcohol provides, and not fear being judged, disliked, or worse yet, rejected. And the benefits of all of this, well, they go far beyond blood pressure. There's no more anxiety or regret the next day, no wondering what I said or did, no emotional crash. I don't ride that 24-hour roller coaster anymore where you go from a big social high followed by the inevitable low the next day. Instead, I get to be present, I get to remember it clearly, and I wake up feeling steady and clear, and it helps me stay more consistent with exercise, with quality sleep, with healthy eating, and showing up in relationship with others in the way that I want to. So while the blood pressure benefits of reducing alcohol might not be massive for everyone, I do think that the overall upside, at least in my experience, has been huge. And just to come back to the guidelines here for a moment, the ESC guidelines directly state, and I quote, "Emerging data indicate it is likely healthiest to avoid all alcohol where possible," end quote. Just to finish on alcohol, I have zero judgment towards anyone who drinks, but I do think it's worth looking at if your health isn't where you want it to be, or if you are thinking about protecting your health in the coming decades. Alcohol aside, let's talk about a few other commonly consumed beverages. I know many of you will be wondering about coffee. Does coffee affect blood pressure? According to the ESC guidelines, coffee intake is not associated with hypertension. However, energy drinks containing ingredients like taurine and caffeine increase blood pressure and may lead to acute or chronic cardiovascular complications in young adults. Now, you might be wondering, if caffeine raises blood pressure, which it does, why doesn't coffee associate with high blood pressure? This brings us back to a very important principle that we talk about a lot here on The Proof, the food matrix. Coffee is more than just caffeine. It contains a number of bioactive compounds like chlorogenic acids, which are polyphenols, which are thought to have blood pressure lowering effects. So when consumed as a whole food, as coffee, the net effect is not an increase in blood pressure. It's worth pointing out as well, because this can be confusing, that acutely coffee may increase blood pressure in someone who doesn't regularly consume it. If you take someone who doesn't drink coffee, you give them one, you might see an increase in blood pressure. But in those who are regular coffee consumers, it doesn't seem to have the same effect. There's also evidence, at least in children and adolescents, that sugar-sweetened beverages increase blood pressure, which researchers believe could be caused by activation of the sympathetic or fight or flight nervous system, and also potentially from fructose metabolism. Another reason to avoid these and instead drink water, tea, or coffee for thirst. So that's beverages. What about smoking? When it comes to smoking, while we know it's arguably the best thing that you can stop for your cardiovascular health, the effect on blood pressure doesn't seem to be as significant as other parts of our lifestyle that we've discussed, such as diet and exercise. Interestingly, though, there is emerging evidence that e-cigarettes may elevate blood pressure. So just something to keep an eye on if you have switched from cigarettes to vaping. Vaping is most likely a net positive move, but still likely not to be a risk-free activity. Finally, there is some evidence, although I will say it's fairly weak at this stage, that stress reduction through practices like guided breathing, yoga, and meditation particularly transcendental meditation, can lower blood pressure. There's also evidence of an association between sleep restriction and high blood pressure, suggesting that sleep optimization is another strategy that may help lower blood pressure. However, the effect of these changes are currently less established than the big six, which we covered, which again are weight loss, adopting a healthy diet like a DASH diet, reducing sodium intake, increasing potassium intake, engaging in regular physical activity, and moderating alcohol consumption. And it goes without saying that whether you are taking blood pressure lowering medications or not, these lifestyle changes, particularly the big six that we've just covered, these are foundational to your health, no matter what. Just because you take an antihypertensive medication doesn't mean that these habits won't improve your health. They will. And in fact, if you are taking blood pressure lowering medications, these lifestyle changes will likely help reduce the amount of medicine that you need to take, thus reducing your risk of adverse effects and lower your overall risk of cardiovascular disease through other mechanisms aside from their effect on blood pressure, through improvements in blood glucose, improvements in cholesterol levels, etc. As such, if you are on blood pressure lowering medications and you start making lifestyle changes, you want to let your doctor know so that you can avoid your blood pressure going too low. Okay, I think we did it. Let's recap. High blood pressure is common. It is typically silent and it can be deadly, but it is addressable. It is fixable. The first step is knowing your number. So here's my challenge. Check your blood pressure this week. Share your number in the YouTube comments and send this episode to someone who hasn't checked their blood pressure in years. The more people who measure their blood pressure and take action, the more lives that we can save together. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode. Oh, still here? Looking for a cheap laugh? Okay. If I have to. Actually, you know what? Scrap that. Let's leave you with a book recommendation instead. There's a great new book that I found recently called How to Solve 50% of Your Problems. I recommend buying two. Get out of here. See you next week.